In the year 2000, Sony didn't have a rival in gaming, they had an empire. The original PlayStation had sold over 102 million units. The PlayStation 2 launched that March in Japan and moved 980,000 machines in 48 hours. By the time it hit North America in October, Sony was the cheapest DVD player on the market, the most powerful console on the market, and the only company with a credible roadmap into the next decade. Developers lined up to build for their hardware, retailers bent shelf space around Sony's release schedule, magazines ran cover stories asking whether anyone ever would catch them. The competition? Nintendo was retreating into handhelds. The GameCube wouldn't ship for another 18 months, and nobody at Nintendo seemed in a hurry. Sega was already dying. The Dreamcast would be discontinued by March 2001. Within 5 years, it would be gone from the console business entirely. Nobody was coming for the throne. Then, a company that made spreadsheets and operating systems decided to build a video game console. The gaming industry laughed. Sony didn't. This is the story of how an undisputed empire ignored a lethal, asymmetric threat until it was too late. Not because the threat was small, because the empire couldn't imagine that a software company could fight a hardware war. A $599 mistake, a red ring that cost $1 billion, a 30-second video that ended a console generation. They thought it couldn't happen to them. They were wrong. To understand how Sony lost the next war, you have to understand how completely they won the first one. The original PlayStation wasn't even supposed to exist. In 1991, Sony was meant to be Nintendo's partner, a CD-ROM add-on for the Super Nintendo. The deal collapsed in public, on a trade show floor, when Nintendo announced they were jumping to Philips instead. Sony's executives went home humiliated. They turned that humiliation into a weapon. The original PlayStation didn't just enter the market, it rewired it. Before Sony, gaming was a toy industry. After Sony, it was an entertainment industry. The PlayStation brought CD technology, 3D graphics, and cinematic production values into a device that sat under your television. It made gaming feel adult. Then came the PlayStation 2, and the PS2 wasn't a console, it was a deployment. Backwards compatible with every PS1 game ever made. DVD player built in, at a moment when standalone DVD players still cost $600 or $700, launched at $299. In Japan, it was, for months, the cheapest legal way to watch a DVD movie. Parents bought it for the movies. Their kids inherited the games. Sony wasn't selling hardware. They were installing infrastructure. Every PS2 in a living room was a lock on the next decade of software sales. By 2005, the PlayStation 2 had sold over 100 million units. Developers were running their entire studios on Sony's roadmap. The empire was untouchable. And inside that empire, a fatal assumption hardened into Doctrine. Nobody can challenge us on hardware. Nobody. Microsoft had no history in gaming, no arcade legacy, no characters, no cartridges in the ground. What they had was something more dangerous, a beachhead. The PC was already a gaming platform, and Microsoft owned the operating system it ran on. Every game that shipped on Windows was a data point about what players wanted, how long they played, and what they paid for. Microsoft didn't need to guess what the market looked like. They could read the telemetry. In the late 1990s, a small DirectX team inside Microsoft started building a console prototype on the side. They called it the DirectX box. Seamus Blackley walked a working version into Bill Gates' office in a homemade case. Gates greenlit the project. Marketing shortened the name to Xbox. In 2001, they made their move. A PC in a console's body, hard drive built in, Ethernet port standard, a broadband machine in a dial-up world. Microsoft wasn't building a toy. They were building a platform, something that could update, connect, and evolve after you bought it. And they had one weapon Sony didn't: Halo. Originally a Mac strategy game from a small studio called Bungie, Microsoft bought the entire company for around $30 million and turned Halo into the Xbox launch title, Halo. Combat Evolved didn't just sell Xboxes, it proved that a first-person shooter could define a console the way Mario defined Nintendo. 1.5 million Xboxes were sold in the first 6 weeks in North America. Microsoft committed over $500 million to the launch marketing campaign. Sony noticed, but they didn't flinch. The next generation was the first real war, and Microsoft fired first. November 2005. The Xbox 360 launched a full year before the PlayStation 3. 1 year of uncontested shelf space, 1 year of holiday sales with no Sony counterattack, 1 year of developers learning a new machine while the PS3 was still being assembled. That head start was everything. The launch itself was chaos. Microsoft shipped fewer than 300,000 units in the first weeks. Stores ran out instantly. Scalpers were flipping consoles on eBay for over $1,000 a piece. The shortage became free advertising. Every empty shelf was a sign that the new Xbox was the machine you couldn't get your hands on. In that first year, Microsoft launched Gears of War, a chainsaw shooter that became the defining 360 aesthetic. Halo 3 was already on the horizon. By the time Sony's machine arrived, the 360 had already installed itself in over 10 million living rooms. Xbox Live was running, with around 6 million paying subscribers. The online infrastructure that Microsoft had bet on was already functional. Gamers had friends lists, achievements, digital storefronts, things the PS3 didn't have at launch and wouldn't have properly for months. Microsoft had seized the initiative. Sony was on the back foot for the first time in a decade. And then Sony made it worse, much worse. E3 2006. Ken Kutaragi took the stage and announced the price of the PlayStation 3, $599. The room didn't cheer. The room didn't gasp. The room went silent. That kind of silence that happens when everyone in the audience simultaneously realizes they've just witnessed a strategic disaster. Kutaragi wasn't apologetic. He suggested that consumers who couldn't afford it should work harder. He said, "We want people to feel that they want it, regardless of anything else." This wasn't pricing strategy. This was imperial contempt. The presentation kept getting worse. A demo titled Genji had a Sony executive solemnly explaining a giant enemy crab. Ridge Racer became a meme overnight. A real-time weapon change demo turned into a punchline before the video had finished playing. Kutaragi himself, the engineer who built the original PlayStation, was quietly removed from PlayStation leadership within weeks of E3 2006. The godfather of the empire pushed out by the empire itself. The PS3 was over-engineered. Its cell processor was a technological marvel that almost nobody could program efficiently. Sony had built a supercomputer and asked game developers to figure out how to make fun with it. Third-party studios spent months just getting their engines to run. Some gave up. Gabe Newell of Valve called the PS3 a waste of everybody's time on the record. They built for the 360 first and ported to the PS3 second. Multi-platform games ran visibly worse on Sony's hardware. The weaker machine got the better games because it was easier to use. Sony's empire had produced the most powerful console in the world and the hardest one to build for. That's not a strength. That's a vulnerability dressed in titanium. But here's the thing about empires and the people who challenge them. Nobody stays clean. Microsoft had the lead, the install base, the online infrastructure, the developer support. And underneath all of that momentum, a time bomb was ticking inside every single Xbox 360. The red ring of death, a catastrophic hardware failure. The console would simply die. 3 red lights around the power button. No warning, no fix. Just a dead machine and a customer who wanted answers. Internal engineering memos, surfaced years later in court filings, suggested Microsoft engineers had flagged thermal and solder joint problems before launch. Leadership shipped anyway. They needed to beat Sony to market, and the head start was worth more than a delay would cost. That was the bet. The failure rate was staggering. Estimates ranged from 23% to over 50%, depending on the model and the source. Microsoft was shipping consoles they knew might break. And when they broke, the replacement consoles broke too. Peter Moore, the head of Xbox at the time, eventually walked out in front of a camera and admitted the company would take a $1.15 billion charge against earnings to cover repairs, over $1 billion. Not on marketing, not on games, on fixing a machine they should have tested before they shipped it. Microsoft extended the warranty to 3 years on every 360 in existence. Microsoft had won the first battle with speed. They lost the second with reliability. The Empire was wounded. The Challenger was bleeding. The war was now a stalemate fought on 2 fronts. Slowly, Sony corrected course. The PS3 dropped in price. In 2009, Sony launched the PS3 Slim at $299. Sales nearly tripled within 6 months. The cell processor's learning curve flattened as studios finally cracked its architecture. Sony's first-party studios, Naughty Dog, Santa Monica, Guerrilla Games, started delivering exclusives that looked like nothing on the 360. Uncharted 2 launched in 2009 to a Metacritic average of 96. The Last of Us in 2013 scored 95, God of War, Killzone, Heavy Rain, a library of cinematic single-player games that nobody else could match. Sony also quietly copied Microsoft's playbook. PlayStation Plus launched in 2010, a paid online subscription that delivered free games every month, the same idea as Xbox Live, executed with a Sony twist. The narrative flipped. By the end of the generation, the PS3 had caught the Xbox 360 in global sales. Both machines finished roughly tied at around 84 million units, but the psychological damage was done. Sony had entered as the undisputed king and left as an equal. That's not a recovery, that's a demotion. And while these two giants tore at each other for the hardcore market, Nintendo released the Wii, a motion-controlled box with weaker graphics than either competitor. It sold over 100 million units. Both Sony and Microsoft missed it entirely. Microsoft, meanwhile, had learned the wrong lesson from the 360's success. They believed the future was the platform, not the games. Xbox Live, the marketplace, the subscription model, these were the weapons that had given them the early lead, so they doubled down on services, on connectivity, on a vision of the console as an always online entertainment hub. They were about to walk into an ambush. May 2013, Microsoft unveiled the Xbox One. What they showed was not a game console, it was a multimedia command center, TV integration, voice commands, Connect required, always plugged in, always watching, always online, no used games. Your game disc was a license. Your console was a portal, and that portal only stayed open if it was connected to the internet, every 24 hours. Don Matrick, head of Xbox, told an interviewer that anyone without internet should buy an Xbox 360. he said it on camera, smiling. For military families on overseas bases, for rural users with unreliable connections, that was the answer from the head of the platform. Weeks before the reveal, Microsoft creative director Adam Orth had posted "Deal with it" on Twitter, mocking consumers worried about the always online requirement. He was gone from the company within days. Microsoft thought it was an isolated PR fire. It wasn't. It was a preview. The backlash was nuclear. Gamers didn't see innovation. They saw control, a machine that told you when you could play, a camera that watched your living room, a device that killed the secondhand market, and then asked you to say, thank you. Pre-orders for the Xbox One collapsed. Pre-orders for the PS4, which had only been announced as a name and a logo, spiked. Sony watched. They watched the reaction, they watched the forums, they watched the pre-orders shift. And then, at E3 2013, lead system architect Mark Cerny walked onto the stage and described a console that had been, in his words, designed by listening to developers. Then Sony announced the price, $399. No always online requirement, no restrictions on used games, no Kinect, no camera. Just a machine that played games. The crowd erupted, not with polite applause, with the sound of people who had just been rescued. Then Sony released a video. 30 seconds, no narrator, no graphics, just Shuhei Yoshida and Adam Boyes, two Sony executives, standing in front of a plain backdrop. One of them holds a PS4 game disc. He hands it to the other hands it back. Title card, PlayStation 4. This is how you share games on PS4. That was it. That was the kill shot. Inside Sony, the video had been shot in under an hour with no formal script, right after Yoshida saw Microsoft's used game policy slides leak online. There was no agency pitch, no focus group, just two executives, a camera, and a disc. No attack ad, no comparison chart, no direct mention of Microsoft. Just a dead simple demonstration that Sony's machine respected your ownership and Microsoft's didn't. The video went viral within hours, over 17 million views in the first 2 weeks. It became one of the most watched advertisements on YouTube that year, and Sony hadn't paid for a single second of distribution. It wasn't a marketing campaign. It was an execution. Microsoft reversed every policy within 2 weeks. Always online, gone. Used game restrictions, gone. Required Kinect, gone. The Xbox One was relaunched as the machine it should have been from the start. Don Matrick, the man who told disconnected players to buy a 360, left Microsoft entirely within weeks. He went to run Zynga, but the damage was permanent. The PS4 sold over 1 million units in its first 24 hours on sale in North America, 7 million by April 2014. The Xbox One never caught up. The PS4 outsold the Xbox One more than 2-to-1 across the entire generation. Sony didn't win with better hardware. They won by letting Microsoft destroy itself and then standing in the rubble holding a disc. After the Xbox One disaster, Microsoft didn't retreat. They pivoted. Phil Spencer took over Xbox in 2014 and began a quiet, methodical transformation. The Kinect bundle was killed within months, dropping the Xbox One price to match the PS4. Backwards compatibility with Xbox 360 games came in 2015. Crossplay, cross-buy, cross anything that lowered the barrier between Microsoft's box and yours. The console war, as fought in 2005 and 2013, was over. Sony had won the hardware battle twice, so Microsoft stopped fighting on Sony's terms. Game Pass launched in June 2017, a subscription service that gave you access to hundreds of games for a monthly fee. Netflix for games. Day one first-party titles included. No need to buy a disc, no need to choose a single game, just access. Then came the acquisitions. Mojang, the studio behind Minecraft, for $2.5 billion in 2014. Bethesda, makers of Skyrim and Fallout, for $7.5 billion in 2021. Then, the biggest deal of all, Activision Blizzard, $68.7 billion in 2023. Call of Duty, World of Warcraft, Candy Crush, all under one roof. Microsoft was no longer trying to sell you a box, they were trying to own the supply chain. If Game Pass became the default way people consumed games, the hardware wouldn't matter. You'd play on Xbox, PC, phone, or television. The platform was the service. The console was just one door into the room. Sony saw the shift. PlayStation Now was rebranded, restructured, and merged into PlayStation Plus. In 2022, Sony bought Bungie, the original Halo studio, for $3.6 billion. The response was reactive, defensive. The empire was still standing, but the ground was moving underneath it. The PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series launched within days of each other in November 2020 into a world where nobody could buy them. A global semiconductor shortage choked supply for nearly 2 years. Scalpers ran bots against retail websites. Stock drops became national news. By the time supply stabilized in 2022, both machines had already defined the generation by absence. On paper, the hardware was nearly identical, same AMD architecture, same solid-state drives, same resolution targets. The PS5 loaded games slightly faster. The Series X had a small edge in raw teraflops. For 99% of players, the difference was invisible. The days of one machine dramatically outperforming the other were over. But the strategies had diverged completely. Sony was still selling a console, a premium, exclusive-driven machine built around blockbuster games you couldn't play anywhere else. God of War Ragnarok, Spider-Man 2, Horizon Forbidden West. The strategy was, buy our box because you can't get these games on any other box. In November 2024, Sony released the PS5 Pro at $700. They were testing how high the premium ceiling could go. Microsoft was selling access, Game Pass on console, Game Pass on PC, Game Pass on mobile, Xbox Cloud Gaming, streaming to anything with a screen. The strategy was, it doesn't matter which box you buy, as long as you're paying us every month. Two different doctrines, same battlefield. By 2025, the PS5 had outsold the Xbox Series roughly 2-1. Sony was winning the hardware war, but Microsoft's Game Pass subscribers had grown past 34 million in early 2024 before plateauing. The subscription revenue was recurring, predictable, and growing. The growth curve was bending. One company was winning units, the other was building a utility. The question wasn't who was winning. The question was which metric would matter in 5 years. The PlayStation versus Xbox war isn't really about consoles. It never was. It's about what happens when an empire becomes so dominant that it stops studying the threat. Sony in 2005 looked at Microsoft and saw a software company playing with hardware. They didn't see a predator reorganizing the entire food chain. Microsoft in 2013 looked at their own platform and saw the future. They didn't see that they were building a prison and calling it innovation. Both empires made the same mistake at different moments. They fell in love with their own vision and stopped looking at what the other side was actually doing. This pattern is older than gaming. IBM in the 1980s controlled enterprise computing the way Sony controlled the living room. A small software company called Microsoft license an operating system from them, and within a decade, owned the part of the value chain IBM had given away for free. Blockbuster watched Netflix mail DVDs in red envelopes and laughed. They were not laughing when streaming arrived. The empire that gets disrupted is rarely beaten by a bigger competitor. It is beaten by a different kind of competitor, one that does not look like a threat until the day it owns the rules. The lesson isn't be like Sony or be like Microsoft, it's this. In any war for dominance, business, content, technology, like the threat that destroys you never looks like you. It comes from a different industry, a different model, a different set of assumptions. Sony's mistake was ignoring the software company. Microsoft's mistake was ignoring the consumer, the empire that protects its throne. By pretending the challenger doesn't exist, always learns the same lesson. Too late. In blood. And if you want more classified briefings on the wars that shape the modern world, subscribe and turn on notifications. The next file is already declassifying.